different churches are faithfully navigating the pandemic, how we're dealing with shifting demographics, how we're looking toward the future God has in store for us. And I know that you're doing that work here. So as I've been thinking about you and Mindy and your church and the title of this forum, I've been wondering, how do we build a legacy? The Bible's full of examples of people who've left an impact. It's easy to look at Moses or Abraham, Elijah, Jesus, or Peter, but there are problems with lists like those. If the only way one can leave a legacy is to part the Red Sea or to be swept away to heaven via a flaming chariot or to die and rise again 3 days later, then few of us will measure up. I should also note that far too often these high bar setting lists are almost exclusively male. And I think we can and should do better than that. So as I've thought about what it might look like to build a legacy, I'm reminded of my own grandmother, who was born and raised just over the Smoky Mountains from you folks in Tennessee. I'm reminded of my own mother, who, as a single mom, made sure that we had a stable place in our lives, and that place was the church. And today, I'm reminded of the letter that Paul wrote at the end of his life. He might have written it from prison. He definitely wrote it having been abandoned by almost everyone. It's a letter he wrote to his young friend Timothy. It's a letter about legacy. In the first chapter of the second letter to Timothy, there's verses 3-5, Paul writes to his friend. He says, "I'm grateful to God whom I worship with a clear conscience, as my ancestors did, when I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. Recalling your tears, I long to see you, so that I may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that lived first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure lives in you." Here at the end of his life, wondering what legacy he might leave, Paul remembers. He recalls. He is reminded of a faith that is alive, a faith that does something. In remembering and recalling and in reminding one another of a faith that lives, I think we might just have a recipe for building a Christian legacy. I'll call her Sally. Several years ago, she decided to join a trip that her church was taking to Zambia. She'd never been to Africa. She had no connection to the place, but she felt a nudge by the Spirit to sign up and see what the Presbyterian church in Zambia was up to. So she went. And while in the country, Sally got to know a female pastor. We'll call her Beth. Beth was a rarity in Zambia. There aren't yet a lot of female pastors there. But Beth had gone to seminary and had faithfully served the church for years, oftentimes going months without pay. Sally, this American woman who had no prior connection to Zambia, was moved in the most unexpected ways as she learned about the trials and blessings that Beth had endured as a pastor in Zambia. At one point during the trip, Sally asked Beth about when she planned to retire. Beth gave her a confused look and told this well-meaning but naive American visitor that she had no way to retire. The Presbyterian church in Zambia did not have a pension system. I mean, remember, Beth would oftentimes go months without being paid, even while she was working. So Sally came home from Zambia. She was troubled at the thought that her new friend, her new sister in the faith, Beth, who had so faithfully served the church for years, that she would never be able to retire. Sally talked with her family, and she decided she was going to set up a retirement fund for Beth. It wouldn't change the system for all the other pastors who had no pension, but it would change Beth's life. You see, legacy is always about relationship. Sally didn't know what she didn't know until she got to know Beth. Beth, this Zambian pastor who lived her life, who lived her faith in remarkable ways. It would be a great story if that was it, but that isn't the end of the story. As Sally was setting up Beth's pension, Beth died. And that could be the end of the story, but it is not. Because a legacy built on a faith that lives, well, it carries on even in the midst of death. Sally called me last year to tell me about Beth and her life and her death. And then Sally decided that she wanted to take the funds that were going to cover Beth's pension, and instead she would set up a permanent scholarship fund to help pay for Zambian women to go to seminary to become pastors. Because of Beth's sincere faith, a faith that was exemplified in her life, Sally's own faith was nurtured, it was emboldened and expanded. And now women in Zambia will have one less hurdle to attend seminary, to follow God's call on their lives. I wonder if one day female pastors in West Africa and the churches they serve, if they might say, echoing Paul, I'm reminded of the faith that lived in Sally and before her in Beth. That's how a legacy of faith is built. We remember and we recall, we remind one another of a faith that lives, a faith that does something. I was a fairly new pastor. Jean was a 98-year-old longtime member of the church. At this point, she lived in an assisted living facility, but only because she couldn't drive. Her hands were shaky, but her mind was steady as could be. A dear friend, 20 years her junior, drove her to church each Sunday, and about once a quarter, I would visit her at her apartment. Jean made a habit of reminding just about everyone that she and her late husband, that they had decided to leave 90% of their sizable estate to the Presbyterian Children's Home, with the remaining 10% to go to the church. Jean never had any children, and the children's home had a special place in her heart. And she reminded just about everyone that these sorts of plans mattered. And in her opinion, her very strong opinion, she was shy about very little, she wanted people to know that the church had a place in her will. On this particular visit, Jean was resting in her bed. She was dressed to the nines. She was always put together. Her collection of fancy glasses was remarkable. And toward the end of our visit, she asked me to reach into her desk next to her bed and grab her checkbook. She said she needed to write a check to the church. So I reached in and grabbed a checkbook that was more like a check binder, the sort of thing my children will never see. I laid it across her lap and I gave her a pen, and then I sat down. Jean held the pen with her shaky hands and she proceeded to sign the check. She then set the pen down and she pushed the check binder toward me and she said, "Joseph, I want you to write the check." Now, they did not teach us in seminary what to do when a member of the church gives you a signed blank check and asks you to fill in the rest, which in this case would be the largest check I had ever written. But I knew enough, even as a new, inexperienced pastor, that this had the potential to look really, really bad. And Jean, who must have noticed the horrified and confused look on my face, she pushed the check binder back toward me and she said, "Well, come on now." And I looked at her and I said, "Miss Kendall, I cannot write this check for you. How do you think that would look?" And she peered over me, over her fancy glasses, and without skipping a beat, she said, "Well, you're here. You might as well make yourself useful." Stunned, I wanted to say, "Well, has the last 30 minutes not been useful?" And instead, I wrote the check. Now, as soon as I left her apartment, I immediately called the elder that brought her to church every Sunday, as well as the church treasurer, They appreciated the call, and then they laughed at me as if they were in on some joke with Jean. But Jean's admonition has stuck with me. Jean, the woman who knew that we need to be reminded so that we might be inspired to leave a legacy. She summed up her life in that admonition. You're here. You might as well make yourself useful. Paul, he spoke of Lois and Eunice. I've mentioned Beth and Sally and Jean and my grandmommy Sarah. Those are people in whom I have seen a sincere faith live. But you have your own list, a list of people that you remember, a collection of stories of faith and generosity at First Pres Durham that you recall. It's how you build a Christian legacy. You build on a Christian legacy when you tell those stories, the big ones and the small ones. You remind yourselves and one another that going all the way back to Lois and Eunice, our faith is lived out in tangible ways. It's why luncheons and legacy societies matter. My friend Jean was right. A faith sincerely lived is a faith that does something. For the ways in which each of you participate in that faith at First Pres and beyond, no matter how big or small, whether through the Legacy Society, through worship, through racial reconciliation work, for all the ways, thank you. Thank you for being here and for doing something. Amen.